Hello, everyone. Good evening. You can certainly tell from my surroundings here, the back window. It is the evening of the day here in the middle of the week. I have a little dog who's on the couch there, who's kind of in guard dog mode.
Mm.
So just if he kind of blows up in a fit of barking, I apologize in advance. I'm Matt Stranick. It's good to be with you, and my awesome colleague here is
It's Daniel Hayward here again. How's it going?
Yeah, how's it going, everybody? And I'm gonna put it back to you, man. Well, first of all, I'm gonna say thanks for asking. In terms of fully re-engaging with the world in 2023, a lot of
Hmm.
people are like, I had to go back to work the third day of the January, and I'm just still like, I'm embracing the possibilities of the new year from
Hmm.
my unemployed perch here in Kamloops. So that's kind of my preamble. And also, I'll just put it out there in broadcasting and podcasting and even educational standards that this is a redo of a previous episode because
Yes.
as we develop this format, sometimes there are quality control issues, sometimes there are production hiccups and the like. Yeah, Dan has come up with, we kind of collaborated a bit on the topic, but Dan kind of ultimately pinned it down in what will hopefully be a series of in local scenes because as a recurring theme or whatnot.
Hmm.
Dan kicked it off with talking about the place that I'm located now, British Columbia, which generous of you to do so, dude. Can I just ask what compelled you to start with BC as opposed to any other spot?
Well, working left to right, I guess. Um, and also, I mean, I've lived in BC. I lived in BC for a little while, sort of in the, I spent sort of the later part of the '90s and the early part of the aughts in different parts of BC before I moved
Where
back
can I can I ask
um,
whereabouts without making a total digression?
Victoria, which
Okay.
that's why three of my pick or two of my three picks are bands from like Victoria in the general vicinity of the '90s,
Okay.
because they're bands. Actually, full disclosure, one of them practiced in the basement of a house that I lived at one point. Well, it was like one of those things, like the one, like, for lack of a better term, punk house that had been
Okay.
going, that had like a practice space, an ongoing practice space in the basement used by a few different bands, including one of the ones that I picked. That at the time, in fact, had you asked me at the time, I may not have said they were one of my favorite bands. I may have said something to the effect of, "God damn, if I have to hear that song one more time." Um, but I lived in Victoria for a couple of years. I
Okay.
had an ill-advised detour through Vancouver for a bit, extended hangover basically. I lived in the Kootenays for just under a year before I came back to the East Coast. And
Was that like Castlegar or Golden
uh
or something like that? Or
Nelson, though I
Nelson?
spent a bit of
Okay.
time in Castlegar. My One of my roommates was in Castlegar.
Okay.
So
I'm trying to bolster my very incomplete and haphazard knowledge of British Columbia, both geographically and culturally. So,
mhm,
yeah, well, that's awesome, man. Well, why don't we just kick right into it, dude? So,
sure.
I've got the document open in front of me, and I'm gonna just scroll down here so I can just sort of illuminate myself
Yeah.
with the notes as you kind of describe it for better
Yeah.
context and such. So,
Okay. I guess before I jump into my first pick, I
oh
wanted to
yeah,
mention a couple of things from a couple of quick footnotes from previous episodes.
oh please do.
Just things that came up.
Sure.
Uh, on the second episode, that's technically episode one,
Mm-hmm.
of the bands that change your life for better or worse, De La
Yep.
Soul, who I'd mentioned previously, their discography had not been available on streaming. It
Okay.
will be on all big streaming services and just out there in the world in print again as of March 3rd of this year. Um,
I hope that means they got a big deal from those
I hope so
platforms
too.
to like get to help them out in their later years or
I
whatever the
think they
case,
they at
right?
least got their own. I think they at least got their master tapes back,
That's
because
what's happening
they
now
had.
with a lot of artists from that era, right? Like
Yeah,
20 years goes by and they have to turn them over, so then they get to do. this kind of funky stuff. That's awesome, Matt.
Exactly. And two of the bands I talked about on the bands that I listened to in 2022 that didn't have a big release, MS Paint and Homefront, have both announced within the last week that they have albums coming out in like the first couple of, both of them will have albums out within the first couple of weeks of March. So
that's that is sick. That is very sick.
Anyways,
good stuff, man. Thanks for the update.
To go to my actual selections, my first pick was a band from Victoria from the mid 90s who kind of moved on to other parts of the world, literally.
Is this the one that you're talking about in the basement practicing here?
No, this is that. I'll get to that band in one of my other picks, but this band is Third World Planet from Victoria.
Okay.
They're originally they're a two-piece band. One of the members had done solo noise performances previously and played in like some other bands in his hometown in Nanaimo before moving to Victoria. And then the other member had been part of a pretty popular local Victoria band called Mexican Power Authority.
I've heard of them. I remember that pretty short, fast, heavy, hardcore stuff, right?
Exactly. I think the song that I included in the footnotes is 7 seconds long. And it's like they actually, they try to they played short, fast songs, but they had an ocarina player, and they throw a weird little melody and stuff like that in it. So Third World Planet were kind of a mix of, I don't know, a mix of like grindcore and what you may call kind of crust punk and noise and, I don't know, emotion. For lack of a better term.
You don't want to use another.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's just like very heartfelt, I guess you could say.
From the heart.
That's what,
where the feelings come from and the emotions. Yeah, okay.
And like I said, they're also, or like I said in my notes, they're possibly one of the most punk rock bands I've ever run into in my life, given that some of their last Canadian tours were conducted by Freight Train. And that when you listen to some of the guitar sounds in their later recordings versus their earlier recordings, it gets deeper and more warped because the guitar player's instrument was getting warped on tour because he'd just bring his guitar in like a soft case while like riding in a grain car. And their drummer could borrow whatever hardware whenever they got to the next town, but he wanted to bring his own guitar, and it got kind of.
I'm thinking of like postmodern Woody Guthrie kind of like picaresque kind of like riding the rail, like Tim Berry from Avail was kind
of yeah, but not
did a lot of travel in that manner. I understand. Yeah.
But instead of playing Big Rock Candy Mountain or some other big something on the folksier side of things, they were doing like 45-second songs with like blast beats, and sometimes like Eric Boros, the guitar player, who also did the solo noise stuff, he would work that into their music as well. And like I remember I saw them live a few times, and there were a couple shows where like it's like Eric would have amps set up for his guitar, and then he'd have an amp set up just for like whatever weird little devices he was going to plug into it. That he would just sort of leave running.
Setup.
Yeah, exactly. To like leave running just to create like, sort of like an ambient background sound bed that they'd sort of work their songs into and out of. And their drummer, Jason Flower, is like, some drummers that play fast, they'll play fast but straight ahead. And watching Jason play was like watching Animal from the Muppets. Just he was all over the place, always throwing in weird little fills or like, playing the rims of things and that kind of stuff and like working those kind of sounds into it instead of just like blast, 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 straight ahead sort of drumming. And as far as releases go, they have a split flexi disc with Republic of Freedom Fighters from Victoria, who were kind of more of a post-punk or like post-hardcore Fugazi-ish type band that actually came through Fredericton and played a really weirdly matched show with the Ripcords at the Farmers Market.
What's the name of this band again, sir?
Republic of Freedom Fighters.
Okay, okay.
Yeah, it was them and Render
Oh,
Useless. Another
dang,
great Victoria band.
dang.
Um,
Okay.
but yeah,
Wow.
anyways, Third World Planet had like a split with this band, Republican Freedom Fighters. I think 1 or 2 7 inches, and then just like they record 8 or 9 songs, and like somebody, the link that I put out was like somebody from Spain that was a friend of theirs got permission to take these like however many songs that they recorded when they stopped off in Toronto one summer and like use somebody's 8 track for a bit, and like then somebody else would you know license those songs or whatever in like a different, like they had a lot of like sort of small releases in from like indie labels in different parts of like all over the world. They were the kind of band that would show up on a lot of like really random compilations sometimes. Um, but yeah, they were active probably, I think, like 94, 95, until they broke. Yeah, they stopped playing, I think, in 1998. The members decided to go on an extended tour of Europe, where one of them ended up running like a squatted arts center in helping run like a squatted arts center in Switzerland for a while, and the other one sort of went and traveled all around other parts of Eastern Europe and like collected all these crazy records and now runs like a collector's oriented record store in Victoria and puts out like reissues of all these different like punk and metal bands from all different parts of Canada and all over the world, like. And yeah, like they really sort of expanded their, instead of just being this band that would play in like your basement somewhere in Western Canada, they really sort of took what they were doing out to the world in a pretty cool way. And the music they made in the process is always something I really enjoyed. So yeah, for the playlist I included, like I said, I think it's like a 16-song demo that they released in Spain in like 1997 or something like that. That is maybe right around 20 minutes of music. That's pretty great. Anyways, that was my first pick. I'll turn it over
Well,
to you,
no,
Matt.
man, that's dope. And again, just sort of just a few, things that you kind of spoken to here. Again, very much about eclectic and creative
Mhm.
individuals and scenes that you're talking about. Eclectic in terms of, their musical approach,
Yeah.
the challenge of the, various DIY formats.
Hmm.
And I like the officially sanctioned bootleg kind of release, which,
Yes.
Pearl Jam and these major label kind of bands have kind of
Hmm.
stepped into. It's like, well, we might as well get paid for them, and I mean, Discord even did that, right? So
Yep.
with their live series. So no, man, that's awesome. Yeah, well, okay, so I guess for mine, I'm just gonna say like. I kind of keep circling back to things a bit, and a
Hmm.
lot of that is just because I have a certain amount of, you know, time other than might I have, say, if
Exactly.
I had an
Hmm.
employment per se. So
Hmm.
I found myself, I guess, not quite as much the past week, but certainly prior to that, in just past Christmas and into early this year, just listening a lot to this one particular Northcote album. Hope is Made of Steel,
Hmm.
and he's from Victoria. I mean, he's based there now. Just to, a point from that came up from one of the previous shows. He actually was in Means. Have you heard of the Christian hardcore band Means from Western
I
Alberta
have
or Western?
not.
Yeah. Okay. They neither have I, but a lot of people have, I guess. Like it
Yeah.
achieved. They did enough
Hmm.
traveling, and they even, I believe, had some kind of connections and rep in the states.
Yeah.
So the dude's been, just kind of he's just doing what people do, working, regular kind of jobs, and
Hmm.
just making his music with, smaller studio or smaller record labels, and then putting them out, medium, sort of mid-level indie kind of labels and such.
Yeah.
Yeah, and he's, one of his releases, he ended up getting to, have Chuck Reagan from Hot Water Music,
Nice.
sing on one of them, and he
Hmm.
toured with Chuck on the solo tours a lot, I guess, during the mid tens or whatever, right?
Yeah.
So, anyways, the dude just got like, he's just an incredibly hard work. He comes across as just being a really, committed, hardworking, youngish dude who's,
Hmm.
roughly around within my age demographic and whatnot. And he's just kind of, you know, it's that up tempo, not punk anymore, but the connection to punk is still very much there.
Hmm.
Kind of music, that sometimes comes out. And yeah, so I mean, again, apologies, Matt Gould / Northcote, for my hollering at you a bit there at the hot water music gig while I was having some beverages. Sincere, it was motivated by sincere amazement and interest
Hmm.
in what I saw going on at the stage. And I'm like, if they can't handle one guy, kind of yelling a bit at the back of a punk venue, then what? It's not really much of a punk venue or show. So anyway,
Hmm.
yeah, man.
Yeah.
So I'll just pass the mic back to
All
you
right.
on your next one. Yeah.
Yeah, my next one actually, getting back to that band that practiced in the basement.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, when I was in Victoria, for part of my time there, I lived at a pretty notorious, you know, punk rock crash pad type house on Chamber Street. That was also a
Okay.
practice space, and this band Daddy's Hands practiced there. Uh,
That's a
who
creepy name for a band, is
and
it?
they were kind of a creepy band intentionally
Okay.
in certain
Okay.
ways. Um,
That was their
One of
thing.
their
All
live
right.
shows that I saw started with someone handing a bucket of raw hot dogs out to the crowd. Um, and meanwhile, the members of the band were all wearing like, tiki masks they found in the garbage and like
And
weird
drugs were not
tuxedo
part of it
jackets
at
and like,
all. There were no drugs at all. It was just
no,
good,
it was a,
clean fun.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
it was,
Okay. I
they were
gotcha.
just, and yeah, like their one of their vocalists basically, Emily, aka Mousy Connection, basically sounded like a haunted doll. um with
That's
sort of like
legit. That's
very
cool, man.
high creepy helium, almost like helium sounding vocals.
Do we get to
uh
hear some of that in the samples that you've
it's in,
attached
yeah,
to
I
the
think one
thing?
of the
Yeah.
song,
Okay.
yeah, she's there, and her and Dave, aka Charter Cruz, the other sort of singer guitarist, both they both traded off vocals on their songs. And yeah, Dave originally started out in a pop punk band called M Blanket, who were part of the whole Slow to Burn Records scene, which like Render Useless, who had mentioned
Okay.
previously,
There we go.
and
Thank you.
a few other bands of that, like from that area from like the early 90s were all on this label Slow to Burn Records. And
Okay.
yeah, M Blanket were one of the kind of breakout ones from there. They would sort of like, raspy voiced East Bay punk sound. But
I'm
just
thinking, I'm,
kept
I'm, I'm
getting
I'm thinking
weirder and weird.
Rancid just by default, but
Yeah.
that's, yeah.
And like, but they're, yeah, like I said, their music just kept getting a little bit weirder. And eventually with Daddy's Hands, like they added just for like the lineup of instruments used in sort of like the primary of the band that I was familiar with. They had two guitar players, a saxophonist who also played like bass clarinet and other just kind of like deep, weird,
I love the
reed instruments. Yeah,
multi-instrumentation.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah.
Another person who switched off between like violin and toy keyboards and like little different little Casios and that kind of thing. And then their drummer had like, regular drum hardware, but also had multiple, like a couple of different garbage cans hammered out to different tones and a literal kitchen sink that he would play with mallets. That, there was definitely like a Tom Waits influence there thrown in with like this sort of like, jawbreakerish, like melodic punk and like almost like a Cramps, John Spencer, like creepy twangy kind of thing. And just, songs can kind of start sounding like they're in one genre and then just veer off wildly towards the end or completely fall apart. Or it could just turn into like, like a cover of like a classic Torch song, or like they have like a weird, like very double entendre, if you understand the language, filled French like cabaret song on their first album, Tutankhamun. Uh, that was the era of the band that practiced in the basement of the house that I lived at at the time. But they started out in, I think, around like 93, 94. They had 2 cassette-only releases, a self-titled one and one called Intelligent and Powerful. Then they kind of regrouped a little bit, had some different members sort of enter and exit the mix occasionally. A couple of the folks in that band, Wolf Parade, who got pretty big on Sub Pop in the aughts, had sort of were part of the band at different points.
Okay.
But yeah,
Part
the
of
core
a
lineup was
collective of sorts.
yeah, kind of. But the core lineup was always kind of Dave, Emily, John, the saxophone clarinetist, and Jonah Fortune, the drummer, who had all the crazy garbage cans and stuff. But yeah, they recorded one full length called Tutankhamun that was supposed to be released by Headhunter Records, I think in 2000. That got to the point of like there were ads and exclaim for it, and like the campus radio station in Fredericton even got a promo copy.
Whoa.
But then that label went out of business, unfortunately, or they went bankrupt. So that release never, I don't think, ever really saw the light of day. Then they did a couple other small recordings in 2002. And then, unfortunately, Emily passed away due to some, addiction-related situations, which, I don't think
sad,
Dave.
Man.
It is. They're kind of. It's like they're a great band that also kind of has like a real tragic story to them.
Okay.
Is the thing, like, because like, the sort of the core duo of the 2 vocalists were also sort of an on again off again romantic couple over the years too. Which really sort of informed a lot of their music, and I think, yeah, they ended up the band recorded one more album after Emily passed away, called Welcome Kings, and actually, that unfortunately just before that got released, Dave passed away in a biking accident in Montreal where he was living at the time. But I thought it was interesting. The cover artist that they got to do the cover for this final Daddy's Hands record was somebody else that lived at that Chamber Street punk house at the time that I lived there, and they practiced in the basement. Pretty great visual artist from Montreal named Keith Jones.
Whoa.
Who was just sort of, another member of that whole scene. Apologies for the dog crawling all over me here.
No apologies.
So yeah, I thought it was kind of cool that they got Keith to do the cover art for that final album, and where it's just sort of a slightly different version of the band. The sound veered a little more towards like the, guitar oriented. I don't want to say indie rock, but sort of like punk indie rock, that end of things, less of like the weird, creepy cabaret and saxophones. But it's still, really great on its own right.
Right.
And yeah, that one, you can find that last album and the 2 cassette-only releases on the band's Bandcamp page that's maintained by their drummer, Jonah Fortune. And also, yeah, you can find the rest of it just like out there on the internet, some of which I've included links to. But they were like one of those bands that I feel like had the members of the band's lives gone a little differently. They probably, would
have kept on for a while.
Exactly. Could have kept going more. Could have, it seems like they got to, between their own sort of situations, just things like, labels going bankrupt and that sort of situation really kind of worked against them as well. But they're still like, I know that they were a band that was really influential on a lot of folks that came out of like especially like the Vancouver Island scene in sort of that mid to late 90s that ended up starting, kind of popular bands that ended up on Sub Pop and labels like that in the early aughts.
You're deliberately not saying the name Hot Heat because I went off apparently.
There was some
a bit of a tangent against Hot Heat. So I'm gonna just say Hot Heat. I'm sorry for the things that I said on the version of this podcast that will never air. I'm sure you're all, cool, creative people in your, midlife of my generation, I would even guess, right? And I hope you're well and successful in your
Mhm.
musical and professional endeavors. So I'll just throw it back to you, Dan.
Yeah. All right. Well, yeah. Like I said, they were a band. Uh, yeah, like I said, Daddy's Hands. They were a band that were, they were the band that the
They
people
were
that
on the
started
cusp
these
of a
bands
larger
went to go.
scene.
They
They were
yeah, they would have seen
influential.
in
They
like a
were.
community center in Fernwood on like
It,
a
it,
Sunday afternoon, and that would have formed. You know, what they were doing would have imprinted on the music that these
you,
folks would have
you,
made
you,
later on
you
in the
got you
world.
got
And
tragic indie vibes throughout,
exactly,
informing it, which adds to a certain almost
like a
you don't want
mystique.
to say myth, but a mystique,
Yeah,
you know.
exactly.
But further than that, I mean, one of the cool things I think about indie music in general is that it is music by people that are relatable, right? They're,
Hmm.
the barrier, hopefully, between persona and, individual tends to, just by default or whatever, tend to be a bit thinner, I think, than in
Hmm.
other formats. So
Exactly.
when you're talking about, you're talking about all the people that came and went through that house. I mean, even the
Hmm.
ones who had nothing to do with the band, their lives were affected, in singular ways from that,
Hmm.
and having been there and been part of that, that are just unquantifiable, as they are immeasurable, as they
I
are as they are ephemeral. And I'm just
he,
going to give a quick I'm
he
giving a quick shout out to the Rick Rubin book about
nice.
creativity that just got published this year. Anyway, sorry,
I
dude.
was I was gonna say, just I want to give a quick shout out as well to another resident of that house around the same time who
Yeah,
would who complained about listening to the band practice a lot along with me. Who's a great writer from based out of I think Denton, Texas now, named Kat Moore.
nice.
Who at the time was just like you know
Part of the
out.
group,
Exactly.
living
Well, no,
there.
she's like
Yeah,
she decided she wanted to see somewhere other than the south, southern U.S. So she ended up moving to Vancouver Island for a bit, and living at this house around the same time I did. And now it's like, she's got, you know, she's she's got quite a
Jade.
few like essays and short stories published. She teaches at University of North Texas as well,
Dope.
and yeah, just like if you ever get a chance to, if you ever see the name Kat Moore anywhere, Kat, uh, yeah,
I'm going to
I would,
ask you to put that in your notes.
I will.
Because this is
Yes.
like the good stuff. We want to be able
Yeah.
to, you know, Kat, if
She's
you're
one of
ever
she's one of
checking
your
this
type
out,
people,
we
Max.
think you're
She's one of
cool.
your
Yeah,
academic type people. Actually, one of
academic
my
ish. Yeah, thank you. That sounds
yeah.
awesome. Yeah.
All right.
Well, no, man, and shout out to all of what you just said. And I really love how the connections between, various artists and various scenes are starting to just become,
Hmm.
explored. And I mean, geez, Dan, I mean, you were there yourself in very, doing very cool things in your own right. You may possibly not agree, but yeah. So anyhow, I'm just gonna kind of rip through two of them at
Yep.
once. Okay.
Okay. Sounds good.
I'm gonna put out just because I actually had to scratch my head a bit about, well, what bands from BC that are even like resonant
Hmm.
or important to me. And yeah, so it was No Means No and DOA, right, are the two. I just have to throw them in there in as much
Hmm.
as they've just been, not so much the things that I've listened to a ton on my record player. I do listen to them. I do throw them on, and I have pieces of their songs, like
Hmm.
especially No Means No, like just etched into my brain. Like, I
Oh
mean,
yeah.
I'll just be like walking around in public, and then it'll just be suddenly, just something from the tower, and it's just and I just want to start cats, sex, and Nazis, and just start bust just busting it out,
Yeah.
right? So, and I guess the other thing too is, I'm actually now on my second book this year, reading about the SoCal punk scene of the '80s.
Hmm.
So I talked about before how I just was finishing up the SST, the history of SST by Jim Ruland. Well, it turns out the same author helped Bad Religion co-write their band's memoir.
Okay.
And that came out just, a couple of years prior. So I just, I bought that the two unbeknownst to each other. And so now I've dived back into finishing the Bad Religion book. So just, for all of, it's like these dudes are like filling in the cast of characters almost to this wider milieu of really just insanely creative, fiercely independent musical people from the mid 70s, up until the mid 80s. I mean, it cements to me just the fact that Canada had a huge presence with, proportionally, right, by population, relative to the population of the States that was doing all that heavy ass punk stuff at the time. It just reinforces my belief that Canada was actually probably punching above its weight in terms of population relative to, our neighbors to the south. So, but anyway, so, and I guess I will say too, I did, I missed the DOA show in Fredericton. That would have been happening, during a time I could have been there. It may have been something as lame as I had to work a shift at McDonald's that night or something, and I just couldn't bust out. But I definitely have a very strong remembrance of the No Means No show. I can't necessarily even tell you who the openers were.
I think it was Roach. I feel it was Roach just because Roach.
I know it was Roach just because you said it. No?
Speaking of Roach, Alan Muir of Roach is still playing music these days. He's got an Irish folk-themed band called the Stab Rovers in Bridgewater, Nova Scotia, where he still skates and stuff, and he's still just like playing this like pogsy, like, Irish folk rock stuff, just out on the South Shore, and it's just, he's still kicking around.
And I never, you were older than me, so you kind of hung out with those guys maybe a bit as socially or whatever. I was like younger and kind of ran with a different crowd, but the fact is, like, Roach were friggin' legends of the Fredericton scene when I was like just starting to go to shows. It was like they put out a 7-inch, man. It was wild, right? Wild stuff. Yeah. So yeah, they opened for No Means No. Unless somebody listens to this and tells us we're wrong, that's the story, and we're sticking to it. So it was a wild night, an awesome night, and just I think I may have even stage dived like one or two times, within that whole. So, anyways, shout out to those two bands for those two reasons. I've got their records. I throw them on from time to time, and then I'll just say, Dan, every one that I've gotten after these is kind of ridiculous. So take your time when you're going through your next one or two, because mine are those could even stay in the notes if need be. But anyway, I'll just I'll let you go, man.
I guess if you're looking for another book to read soon, Joey Shithead from DOA, aka Burnaby City Councilor Joe Keithley.
Yeah.
He has he wrote a memoir, I think in like the late aughts, called I Shithead.
Yes,
I've got a copy of it somewhere around here.
That's awesome, man.
That's definitely worth checking out. And as I mentioned in the previous draft of this episode, there was another book that I'd read not that long ago, Nancy Burrell's I'm Not Holding Your Coat, writing about putting on like shows for like sort of DOA and like their contemporaries and bands like the Dead Kennedys and stuff in Philadelphia in the early 80s.
So she's like a promoter on the scene kind
she
of
was
thing?
A promoter on the scene, and really credits DOA with helping start. It being the band that basically went to every town and said, hey, can you help us get a show at this community center? And then the next time another band came through, they're like, well, I guess we can rent that community center and you can play there. Because, no bars were going to let like bands like DOA or Minor Threat or like SSD Control or something like that. Like they're not going to play like the pub down the street, in 1981 or whatever. Like, no. And so. But if you're looking for some additional reading material to put in there as well.
I'm going to get a job someday, and then I'm going to look back on it like, man, I had all this time and I didn't read nearly enough and whatever. So thanks, man. That's moving up on the TV red file.
So
Good done, man. So
I guess
you got some more, don't you?
yeah. I've got one other. I guess the next big pick I was going to talk about is
Please.
another older band, slightly older band.
Okay.
That features one of my favorite Canadian singer-songwriters, full stop. That being, well, the main band I want to talk about is Jerk with a Bomb, from
Love the name.
Vancouver.
Love the
Yes.
name.
And just in general, I want to talk about sort of the career arc of Steve McBean, their singer,
Steve
guitarist,
McBean.
and
Okay.
sort of, I guess, 50% of Jerk with a Bomb.
Okay.
But yeah, like I said, in my opinion, he's one of my favorite Canadian singer-songwriters.
That's heavy.
Though,
That's good, man.
his the earlier parts of his career were in bands that you wouldn't necessarily associate sort of a singer-songwriter with, like starting with Victoria's Red Tide from the early 80s through like Gus and Mission of Christ, who were label mates of early Offspring, or like the Offspring
Gus.
sort of pre-Epitaph. Gus, who were
from Florida.
They were Gus from Victoria, who had a split with Gus from Florida on No Idea Records. That was
we got to do a whole thing about this
No
in the previous
Records.
draft, didn't we? Yeah. Okay.
Pardon? Yeah.
Okay, but, I'm just gonna say this is astounding to me and further evidence of the creativity and awesome weirdness of alternative music. So
yes.
Do continue, sir. Yeah.
But anyways, yeah. So like this guy Steve, he'd played in all these bands that were not necessarily something you'd think like, hey, that's like a great, it's like a great song, but not like, I don't know.
It's not someone that you say
you could, yeah. But anyways, he had been playing in a band in the mid 90s. Steve was playing in a band called Ex Dead Teenager that were kind of a little more like a Drive Like Jehu sort of thing.
That's a little confrontational for a name of a band, but anyway.
And then Ex Dead Teenager split up, and he and one of the other folks in that band, Josh Wells, who was like part of the same general circle as like Submission Hold we talked on a previous episode.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. They started this band that was just a two-piece, guitar and drums, and Steve singing, Josh doing backup vocals. Though being sort of the multi-talented guy that he is, Josh would play drums but also reach over and play a keyboard with one hand sometimes while harmonizing. And occasionally they'd tour where he'd only have like
Prince doing that,
Yeah, exactly. Like sometimes he'd play with
maneuver.
Yeah. Some of their earlier shows he would play with like a stand-up kit too, like without a kick drum. Just standing there, and he'd do little dances while singing and playing drums and keyboards.
I hope some of this is documented on.
It's
video,
definitely. I'm sure there's got to be videos out there, but they're the kind of band that, like, during a certain period of time, I saw playing basement shows. I saw playing like clubs that would hold like 1,000 people, and just they had the crowd in the palm of their hand the entire time. Nice. Their sound was kind of a mix of like, so you could almost say like alt country, or like heavily like alt country type influence.
That makes my middle-aged man heart
exactly
warm,
that middle-aged
right?
that middle-aged guy music.
Totally.
And they still had like a little bit of almost like new wave edge to them sometimes, or like it's like a bit of a post, sort of like between No Depression and like not quite Joy Division, but that sort of somewhere between the two.
That's nifty. That's a nifty thing to think of. That would actually sound cool. Yeah.
Exactly. And like I said, I saw that band play a ton of times. At one point, I had my main source of listening to their first album when I was in my early 20s was a cassette copy that a friend of mine made that had the first Jerk with a Bomb album on one side, and then a mix of like Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings, and like that was just like that kind of stuff, and just like that was just labeled "Things Are Bad." It was like Jerk with a Bomb on one side of the tape and "Things Are Bad" on the other side of the tape. And that was like during a couple of years where I feel like I took a lot of like 6 or 7 hour long Greyhound rides in various directions. And that was sort of my soundtrack the entire time, was the Things Are Bad side, and 45 minutes of the Things Are Bad side, and then this first Jerk with a Bomb album. And they released 3 full lengths total. There was Death False Metal in 2009, or no, in 1999. The Old Noise in, I think that was like 2001, and Pyrokinesis in 2003. And you can get all these on Bandcamp.
I'm glad
then,
Bandcamp exists for
oh,
this
it's
gray
that
area
that
of
site is like
music that like would otherwise go unpreserved, I think.
exactly.
Yeah, and actually now, just like again thinking back to the previous draft, I remember I said all my last picks were jokes. There's one on there that isn't a joke, and you just reminded me of it now because of that switch out to Bandcamp.
Yeah.
So, but anyways, dude,
But
shout out to Bandcamp.
But yeah, just to sort of get a little more into the career arc of Steve McBean.
Please do.
Jerk of the Bomb, by their third album, Pyrokinesis,
Yep.
they'd gone from just dude like so the stripped down 2-piece. They started out. They added a bass player for some of the tracks in the last album, and they added like a full-time keyboard player who also did vocals sometimes. And then next thing you know, they've got another guitar player, and then next thing you know, it's not really the same band anymore. So they sort of gradually morphed into a new project called Black Mountain.
Yes,
that was a little more of a
who I've heard of, and they gained a fair amount of critical success, right?
Yeah, they've they became pretty critically beloved, and like I always thought it was wild to watch sort of where they went, where that band went, just because, like I said, it's essentially they sprouted from this seed that I used to see play in basements and like shitty bars and not so shitty bars, and then next thing you know, like at one point, Black Mountain, around the time their second album came out, they ended up with a song on the Spider-Man 3 soundtrack, the like emo Tobey
what
Maguire
a happy accident that is. Okay.
Exactly. And then
they could probably still live off that royalty.
For sure.
Yeah,
I'm sure that like definitely contributes.
For sure.
They've still been releasing albums pretty steadily through like the past 2 decades.
Still active.
But at one point, at one point they were like opening for Coldplay on tour. And these are folks that like it's like Submission Hold's roommate, like, or whatever, or their old roommate from back in the time. Just sort of, and it's just kind of wild to see this band go from these like little communities that we talk about, people. And then it's just like, oh wait, they're on the big stage now, but it's still like the same folks. But after Black Mountain had been going for a little while, Steve actually started another project called the Pink Mountaintops.
I've heard of them too.
Is essentially, closer to like a little more electric version of like the earlier Jerk with a Bomb stuff.
Okay.
Where Black Mountain, has a bit of, they use a bit of some of like the more ballady side of, the music they were doing in Jerk with a Bomb kind of still carried through with Black Mountain, but they were a little more of like a big psych rock band,
Right.
Like
electronically
riffs and and then I just thought it was kind of cool that once they started this pretty small stripped down band that just grew and grew and grew until start a side project to sound like the other.
It's like this almost like this organic growth, I just kept thinking of that. Our band could be your life, in as much as this is something where as you say, right, real people, as it were. Some of these people, you may have said hi to, if you see them on the street or whatnot, because from being part of the scene, part of the milieu, if you will. David Cronenberg's got a book about creativity out too. I've been kind of just getting these Amazon things, so I've been my morning started. I had terrible sleep, but my morning started buying a book by David Cronenberg about creativity, sort of a memoir of his life as a filmmaker. So
he was probably the first auteur filmmaker that I really, when I decided I wanted to like get into like the works of a filmmaker.
He's got such a wide and weird body of work, but to me, it's almost secondary to the singularness of his, vision and any insights that I could glean from his life in film, I think would be pretty cool. But
Yeah.
this is completely a digression, and I actually we have a little bit more time here, so I'll just say this one. I'll just kind of plow through the remainders of mine,
Yeah.
and I won't go off on too many tangents. And if I do, just rein me back in.
Okay.
So speaking of things that I discovered, there were Bandcamp, as I just referenced, as Dan was just talking about. There's this band called Oldage. I don't even know how you say it. Not very much about them, but I'm grateful that Bandcamp exists. The only reason I even know about it is because somebody on a Leatherface fan page posted a link to one of their songs on their Bandcamp and just said, this Vancouver band sounds like Leatherface, but kind of on the darker side of it as opposed to the melodic side of it. And I'm like, that is absolutely stuff that speaks to me. So it's just really nasty, dark, hard driving. It's close enough to the border of punk and metal. I think that Lenny Kilmister, wherever he would be listening, would be quite pleased if he were to smile down on it. So I'll just I'll kind of leave it at that. I don't know anything about him really. I don't know anything about their scene based in Vancouver. And then in terms of like just I guess other kind of music has been influential to me. Early Bryan Adams is one of the first musical things. Reckless in particular, I still stand by Reckless as being a tight, awesome album. I might give credit to Cuts Like a Knife if you're drinking enough coolers. If you're drinking enough coolers, Cuts Like a Knife is awesome.
Hey,
and I will not tell you how I came to that knowledge, but just trust me, okay? But then everything else, I mean, is just just completely. It was a singularity. It was a singularity that record and his earlier career, and then it just became kind of middle-aged wanker corporate just dreck, which but still, right? Go Vancouver. Moist, okay. People were like, you might have forgotten about Moist. You might not have ever known about them, but they had that one CD, Silver, and they had that one inescapable video, Push, that was on Much Music all the time. Push just a little too, and the singer, it was good enough for grunge music, and the singer was not unlikable, necessarily. My digression in the notes speaks to my ill-advised attempt at stealing that CD from Sam the Record Man. Kids or my kids' friends who may be watching this, or my kids' parents, God forbid, just don't do that stuff. Yeah. And I realized one day, and I think we should just say, sort of, if we're going to close things down, this should have been on both of our lists, probably. SNFU. How do we not either of us have SNFU on our initial?
You want to know why I don't have SNFU? Because I was saving them for when we talk about, if we ever did a show talking about bands from the prairies.
Shit. Okay. Well, never mind. Are they
That's
from
why.
BC, though?
But yes, SNFU are definitely there. When we do talk about them, I will have things to say.
Okay. So sorry. Just can we digress enough to say, because they're from BC, right?
Well, they're from Edmonton, but they moved to Vancouver, and
that's where I'm thinking of
their singer Kevin Cheapig Chin, he was pretty much a fixture. Yeah, he passed away within the past couple of years, but he was kind of a fixture on the downtown East Side area in Vancouver for a long time.
They made a movie about him. Did you know?
Yeah, there's a pretty great documentary about him.
One of my friends in Vancouver shot me a link to it. It's not based.
I'm pretty sure that was filmed. There's a documentary about Vancouver's problem with keeping venues going in the aughts called No Fun City. That was filming around the same time that I think crosses over with the Cheapig documentary, because they filmed at the bar that he worked at, talking to there, and it was just, I'm sure it was probably the same crew on both of them, but SNFU.
Well, I'm glad we just had the opportunity now to correct that glaring omission.
That was just me being pedantic about that. Was the only reason I didn't include them on my list.
Well, no, man. I just was like, wait a minute, how can we not? But that's good. You were thinking about it intentionally.
with me, it was strictly from the logic that, say, if we were to talk about I'd be more likely to talk about a band like Sloan and a show about them talking about bands from the Maritimes than talking about bands from Toronto.
There we
But
go.
that's me.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Fair enough. No,
Anyways,
okay.
that's just me
I
being a
fully gotcha.
fucking
I
dork.
gotcha. No, man, we got varied perspectives and
Exactly.
varied narratives, both leading into this enterprise and
Yep.
leading out from this enterprise. So that's awesome, man. You know what? We're hitting the 50-minute point here,
Okay.
and I only start to say that if we can just sort of do the
Yep.
rapola now, just because I do have, as we
Prior
probably all do,
commitments.
just some things, right? So
Exactly.
the dog may erupt at the sight of his, person who's coming to pick him up here pretty soon.
Yeah.
Too, so
This guy,
Okay.
I'm surprised this guy hasn't freaked out yet. Even,
that dog
but,
has been doing
yeah.
immensely well. That's very charming. Remind me of your dude's name here.
Henry.
Henry, nice to see you again, Henry, as always.
Yeah.
Okay, so
All
I
right.
guess I'll just say, unless I don't really have any further musical commentary.
Yeah.
Unless you do, Dan. Do you have?
I had. I was just going to
Please
quickly
Let's
run
do
through
it.
my other two. Just give,
Of course.
at least
Give
rattle
them.
off the names of my other two picks.
Please
My
do.
other two picks were two newer bands. One was Needles Pins,
Okay.
from Vancouver. They're
What kind of music?
they are kind of a mix. They're like kind of melodic, like kind of like a mix of like, say, like a Stiff Little Fingers, like undertones sort of thing, with like newer, like almost like hot water music type sounds. Like there's
That is literally
some gruff voiced beardy guys, on the instruments, and sort of on the vocals end of things.
Out of
But
all the
like,
things you mentioned
just
so
the
far,
music
that's the one I'm going to
has
track
more
down
of like an
first.
old school. Yeah, it has more of like an old school kind of like driving power pop rhythm to it most of the time. Yeah, they're pretty great. They're also, a recent artist to put out something on Vancouver's sort of long running Mint Records label.
Yes, awesome.
Yeah,
Love
they
Mint
put out an
Records.
album on Mint, I think in like 2016 or something.
I didn't know Mint were still in existence, but anyway, that's awesome.
I think it's a different person running it now.
Okay.
But anyways, my other pick was a band from Vancouver called Bison. Sometimes known as Bison BC, when they were on a larger label that was a little more legally conscious of other artists that had named themselves Bison, in sort of a Bush X situation. And they're a band that my sister Janice Lynn turned me on to, because she used to see them a bunch when she lived in Vancouver in the early and mid aughts.
Awesome.
And yeah, they're more on like the heavy. They're a metal band. Like they're a heavy metal band, like sort of along the lines of like High on Fire
or Mastodon.
Definitely. I'm sure the comparison has been made at one point or another. It's giant heavy herbivore band.
Yeah, there we go.
But yeah, they're they were signed to Metal Blade Records up through the aughts.
Dig that.
Until around 2013 when they went indie again.
Metal Blade has some consistently good artists. I mean,
and they're and Bison are just great. But they've been getting a little more active again over the past couple of years. They did during the pandemic. They did a live show from the Rickshaw Theater that they sort of made available out there in the world. That was pretty great. And they recently did a show in Hope, BC to help celebrate the 40th anniversary of the release of the film First Blood that was filmed out there.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
I did not know.
Those are my other two picks are Needles Pins and Bison. And then in the footnotes, there's some other good stuff that, you can find in the footnotes.
Well, and this is why the notes, I think, form almost like a zine. Kind of deal.
Yeah.
And this is why I, as my educational nerd way, get a certain enjoyment of putting this up all on the WordPress and increasingly out there on the podcast streamers as well, because we've gotten that basic capacity on the main ones now. I'm pretty sure. So, okay. Right. Well, Dan, thanks as ever. Everybody who's potentially out there, thanks as ever. And, until we get around to it next time, 2 weeks-ish is what we'll be aiming for. Yeah. And that's pretty much it for me.
All right. That's it for me. This has been Today New Brunswick, Tomorrow the World.
It has been.
Bye.
Take care, everybody. Bye.
All right.